Previously, on Scars of Love. The weight of their expectations, their blind adoration of Sinak's wealth, and their refusal to even consider her feelings gnawed at her soul. As she lay in bed that night, exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. In her dream, Felina found herself in an endless golden hallway. The walls shimmered like molten gold, and every step she took echoed eerily. She was barefoot, wearing a dazzling white gown, but her feet burned with every step as though the floor was made of fire. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of strength ignited within her. The path ahead was uncertain, but Felina knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep living like this. The dream had been a warning, a message from her own subconscious, and she couldn't afford to ignore it. This was her life, and it was time she started living it on her own terms. The journey to Dubai had been one of mixed emotions for Felina. Her parents had insisted, urging her to embrace her supposed good fortune, while Ronnie had accompanied her with her usual enthusiasm, determined to make the most of the experience. Dubai was everything they imagined: glittering malls, luxurious boutiques, and endless options for the lavish wedding Sinak had planned. Yet, despite the glamour, Felina's heart remained heavy. Her doubts about her future with Sinak lingered like an unwelcome shadow, but she pushed them aside, hoping against hope that things would somehow work out. On their return to Nigeria, their plane landed in Lagos late in the evening. Exhausted but relieved to be back home, they boarded a hired vehicle to Warri, eager to reunite with their families. The journey was uneventful until the early hours of the morning, when a reckless truck driver swerved onto their lane, colliding with their car. The crash was brutal. Metal crunched against metal, and glass shattered, sending shards flying. Felina and Ronnie were thrown forward, their seatbelts the only thing keeping them from being flung out of the car. When the chaos settled, bystanders rushed to their aid. Both women were alive, miraculously so, but they were bruised, bleeding, and unconscious. They were rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize them. Felina regained consciousness hours later, her face bandaged and her body aching. Ronnie, who had escaped with fewer injuries, was already sitting up in her hospital bed, her relief evident. "Felina," Ronnie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're alive. Thank God we're alive." Felina nodded weakly, her fingers brushing the bandages on her cheek. She didn't know then that the accident had left a scar that would change her life forever. Days later, the bandages were removed, revealing a thin but fairly long scar that ran diagonally across Felina's cheek. The doctors assured her it could be fixed with plastic surgery, but the sight of her face in the mirror left her speechless. Ronnie recovered fully and was discharged soon after, but Felina needed more time to heal. When she was finally well enough to go home, her parents were supportive, showering her with love and encouragement. But the real test came when Sinak arrived to see her. He stepped into her room, his face a mixture of shock and disgust when his eyes landed on the scar. Felina tried to greet him, but his expression froze her words in her throat. "What happened to your face?" Sinak stammered, his voice laced with disbelief. "The accident," Felina began, her voice trembling. "It left a scar, but the doctors said it's not permanent. They can fix it with surgery." Sinak's gaze lingered on her cheek, his lips curling in disdain. "Surgery or not, this is not what I signed up for," he muttered, stepping back as though repelled. "Sinak, it's just a scar," Felina pleaded. "I'm still the same person." He scoffed, crossing his arms. "The same person? Felina, I can't walk into a room with my wife looking like this. Me Sinak, marry a woman with a tribal mark? Never." Felina's heart shattered. She stared at him, hoping he would realize the cruelty of his words, but his expression remained cold. Her parents tried to intervene, pleading with Sinak to reconsider. "It's a small scar," her father said. "The doctors can fix it. Don't let something so trivial ruin everything." Even Sinak's friends spoke up, urging him to be compassionate. But Sinak was unmoved. "I can't do it," he declared. "I have my standards, and this isn't it. The engagement is off." With those words, he walked out, leaving Felina and her family in stunned silence. The days that followed were a blur of pain and disappointment. Felina's parents were heartbroken, blaming themselves for pushing her into a relationship that was never built on true love. Ronnie stood by her side, offering unwavering support and reminding her of her worth. Though devastated, Felina slowly began to realize that Sinak's rejection was a blessing in disguise. The man who had valued her only for her appearance was never worthy of her love. As she looked at her scar in the mirror, She began to see it not as a flaw, but as a mark of survival, a reminder of the strength she had gained through the trials she had endured. Her journey to healing was far from over, but for the first time in years, Felina felt a glimmer of hope. She was free to find her true self and perhaps one day, someone who would love her for who she truly was. The morning after Sinak's departure, Felina's parents sat in their living room, their faces etched with worry. They had seen their daughter's anguish and felt a deep sense of responsibility for her pain. The rejection by Sinak, a man they had celebrated as their family's savior, had left a gaping wound in their pride. Driven by desperation, her father decided to approach the hospital. He met with the doctor who had treated Felina and pleaded for a swift solution. "Doctor, we need your help," he said earnestly. "You mentioned that the scar on my daughter's face can be fixed with surgery. How soon can it be done?" The doctor sighed, his kind eyes betraying his sympathy. "Mr. Ajiro, the procedure is possible, but it requires careful planning and recovery time. Felina will need to consent to it, of course. Have you spoken to her?" "We'll convince her," her mother chimed in. "Please, just tell us when we can begin." The doctor nodded hesitantly. "I'll prepare the paperwork, but I urge you to focus on Felina's well-being, not just her appearance. Scars aren't just physical, they leave emotional marks too." Later that evening, Felina's parents approached her with the news, their expressions hopeful. "Felina," her father began gently, "we've spoken to the doctor. He can perform the surgery soon. You'll look just like you did before the accident, and everything can go back to normal." Felina looked up from her chair, her face calm but her eyes resolute. "Back to normal? You think fixing my face will fix everything?" "Felina, this is for your future," her mother urged. "Sinak will come back once he sees your—" "Stop," Felina interrupted, her voice firm. She stood, the thin scar catching the light as she faced her parents. "If Sinak can't marry me because of a scar, then he doesn't deserve me. I won't undergo surgery for his sake." Her father frowned. "But Felina, think about what you're throwing away. A man like Sinak, Felina said bitterly, only values me for how I look, not for who I am. If this scar makes him walk away, then good riddance. I won't marry someone whose love is so shallow." Her mother reached for her hand, tears brimming in her eyes. "But Felina, you deserve happiness. Don't let this scar stand in the way." Felina softened, her voice trembling with emotion. "Happiness, Mama, isn't about having a perfect face or a wealthy husband. It's about being loved for who you truly are. I deserve that kind of love, and if it means I have to wait, so be it. But I won't change myself for Sinak or anyone else." Her parents were silent, taken aback by the strength of her conviction. They had never seen Felina so sure of herself, so unwilling to compromise. Slowly, they realized that their daughter had grown into a woman who understood her worth far better than they had. Felina's refusal to undergo surgery for Sinak's sake marked a turning point in her life. She began to focus on her own healing, both physically and emotionally. With Ronnie's unwavering support, she started exploring new opportunities and reconnecting with the passions she had once set aside. Sinak, true to his shallow nature, moved on quickly, his ego bruised but his life otherwise untouched. Felina, on the other hand, discovered a newfound strength within herself, a resilience forged through pain and rejection. Though the scar remained, it became a symbol of her survival and self-worth. It was no longer a blemish, but a testament to the woman she had become, a woman who refused to settle for anything less than unconditional love. And for that, Felina knew she had won. With Sinak gone and the weight of his superficial expectations lifted from her shoulders, Felina began to feel a strange sense of freedom. Though the scar on her face had left her with mixed emotions, it also became a catalyst for profound change. She decided to focus on her career, a path she had always dreamed of, but had set aside to accommodate Sinak's constant need for attention. With a degree in anatomy from the prestigious University of Nigeria, Felina had the foundation she needed to build a meaningful and impactful career. Felina applied for a research position at a medical institute in Lagos that specialized in reconstructive surgery and rehabilitation. Her experience gave her a unique perspective, and during her interview, she spoke passionately about the psychological and emotional effects of physical scars. "I've lived with a scar, and I know what it's like to feel the world judge you based on appearance," she said. "But scars tell a story of survival and resilience. I want to contribute to a field that helps people heal, not just physically, but emotionally too." The panel was impressed, and within weeks, Felina was offered a position. The work was demanding but fulfilling. She found herself pouring her heart into research and advocacy, helping patients embrace their scars while also advancing surgical techniques for those who sought change. Not to fit societal standards, but to reclaim their confidence on their own terms. Felina's new routine left her little time for socializing, but she didn't mind. She was rediscovering the essence of life and love, reevaluating what truly mattered to her. One evening, while journaling, she wrote, "This scar may have changed how the world sees me, but it hasn't changed who I am. If no one can love me just as I am, I choose to be single all my life. I won't fix my face for anyone else. If I ever choose to, it will be for me and me alone." These words became her mantra. She learned to love herself in ways she never had before, cherishing her intelligence, kindness, and determination over her appearance. Ronnie remained her closest ally, celebrating every milestone in Felina's career and personal growth. Felina's relationship with her parents also began to shift. Her refusal to undergo surgery for Sinak's sake and her determination to forge her own path had made them reflect on their own values. Slowly but surely, they began to see the strength and beauty in their daughter's choices. "Felina, we were wrong," her father admitted one day. "We let Sinak's wealth blind us to what truly matters. You've taught us that love and respect are worth far more than any riches." Her mother nodded, tears in her eyes. "You're stronger than I ever was, Felina. I'm proud of you." Though offers for reconstructive surgery continued to come her way, Felina declined them all. The scar on her face had become a part of her story, a story of survival, courage, and self-discovery. Her journey wasn't without its challenges. There were days when the stares and whispers of strangers stung, and moments when her reflection brought back painful memories. But with each passing day, Felina grew more confident, more assured of her worth. While colleagues and friends encouraged her to date, Felina remained cautious. She wasn't opposed to love, but she had vowed to wait for someone who would see her for who she truly was. Until then, she was content with her own company and the fulfilling work she was doing. She often told herself, "If love finds me, it will be real. It will be honest. And if it doesn't, I'm still whole on my own." Years passed and Felina's career flourished. She became a respected voice in her field, giving talks and mentoring young professionals. Her story inspired many, and her scar, once a source of pain, became a symbol of strength. Felina had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had found a life of purpose, joy, and authenticity. Whether love ever came her way or not, she knew she had made the right choice, one that honored her true essence and her unwavering belief in her own worth. It was a warm afternoon, and Felina had just settled into a corner of the hospital's canteen, a simple plate of rice and stew before her. She preferred this spot, away from the noise, where she could enjoy her solitude. It was a rare moment of peace in her busy day. As she took a sip of water, a shadow fell across her table. Startled, she looked up to find a strikingly handsome man standing before her. His presence was commanding, his neatly tailored white doctor's coat emphasizing his tall, athletic frame. His eyes were a deep, warm brown, and his smile carried an unassuming charm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and polite, "but why is a sleeping beauty like you eating all alone?" Felina blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She wasn't used to such bold compliments, especially not from strangers. "Sleeping Beauty?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," he said with a small chuckle. "You looked so peaceful when I walked in. I half expected a fairy tale prince to be sitting beside you." Felina laughed despite herself, the sound catching her by surprise. "I don't think fairy tale princes exist," she replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. He took the invitation gracefully and introduced himself. "I'm Dr. Nathaniel Coker, but most people just call me Nate." "Felina," she said simply, shaking his outstretched hand. "Felina," he repeated, as though savoring the sound of her name. A beautiful name for a beautiful lady. Felina felt her cheeks warm, but she quickly masked her reaction by taking another sip of water. "Are you new here?" she asked, eager to shift the focus. "Yes, actually," Nate replied. "I'm on a 2-year research exchange program. I'm a consultant plastic surgeon based in Chicago, but I'm here to collaborate on reconstructive advancements in Nigeria." Felina's interest piqued. "Plastic surgeon?" she echoed. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "And you, Felina? What's your specialty?" "I'm an anatomist," she said, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of shock cross his face. An anatomist? He repeated, leaning forward slightly. Forgive me, but I have to ask. How is it that someone with your knowledge has allowed herself to live with such a visible scar? Felina stiffened. She had anticipated the question, but wasn't prepared for how bluntly it was posed. It's not a matter of allowing, Dr. Coker, she said evenly. This scar is part of my story. I've chosen to keep it, for now. Nate immediately raised his hands in a gesture of apology. I didn't mean to offend. It's just you're too brilliant and too beautiful to let something so fixable hold you back. But I'd love to hear your perspective. Over dinner, maybe? Felina's eyes widened. Dinner? Yes, Nate said, his smile returning. Or lunch, if you prefer. I'd like to get to know you better. Your story, your work, everything. What do you say? Felina hesitated, her mind racing. It had been so long since she'd been approached by anyone, let alone someone like Nate. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her heart beat a little faster. But she wasn't ready to lower her guard so easily. I'm not sure that's a good idea, she said cautiously. Nate leaned back, his expression calm but persistent. I understand. But I'm not asking for anything serious, just a conversation. Let me treat you to a nice meal. And if you decide you don't want to talk to me again, I'll respect that. Felina sighed, feeling the faint stirrings of an attraction she hadn't felt in years. She fought back the sensation, telling herself to remain in control. But Nate's sincerity was disarming. Okay, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. One dinner. Nate's smile widened, lighting up his face. One dinner, he echoed. I promise you won't regret it. As he stood to leave, Felina felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had made her feel this way. Curious, seen, and maybe even a little hopeful. She watched him walk away, fighting the subtle smile threatening to break across her face. For the first time in years, Felina allowed herself to wonder. Could this be the beginning of something new? The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow across the streets as Felina walked into the quiet, unassuming eatery Nate had suggested. It wasn't one of the flashy places she used to frequent with Sinak. No chandeliers, no valet parking, no loud music. Instead, it had a warm, homely feel. Wooden tables were arranged neatly, soft jazz played in the background, and the scent of freshly cooked meals wafted through the air. Felina had spent hours deliberating over what to wear. She chose a simple yet elegant dress, a knee-length navy blue number that highlighted her figure without being overly flashy. Her makeup was minimal, her hair pinned back in a sleek style, and she wore a delicate pair of earrings that caught the light when she moved. She had no intention of trying too hard, but she wanted to remind herself, and perhaps Nate, that beneath her resilience and scars, she was still a woman who deserved admiration. As she scanned the room, she spotted Nate seated at a table near the window. He was dressed casually in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing toned forearms. He looked up from the menu, and when his eyes met hers, a warm smile spread across his face. He rose to greet her, pulling out her chair as she approached. You look stunning, he said, his voice sincere. Thank you, Felina replied with a small smile, her tone measured. This place is nice. Quiet. I thought it would be, Nate said as he sat down. I figured we'd both appreciate somewhere without distractions. Just good food and good conversation. As they placed their orders and the conversation began, Felina remained guarded. She listened intently to Nate, noting the way he spoke about his work, his family, and his experiences in Nigeria. He shared stories about growing up in Lagos before moving to the US for medical school, his passion for helping people, and his admiration for his mother, who he described as the strongest woman he'd ever known. What about you? Nate asked, leaning forward slightly. How did you find yourself in the field of anatomy? Felina hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to being asked about herself in such an open and genuine way. It was a natural choice, she said finally. I've always been fascinated by the human body, how it works, how it heals. And now, I think my personal experiences have deepened that fascination. Nate nodded, his eyes thoughtful. I admire that. It's not easy to turn pain into purpose. Felina felt a small flicker of warmth at his words, but she quickly reminded herself of her resolve. She wasn't here to be swept off her feet. She was here to understand who Nate was, to gauge his values, his intentions, and whether he truly understood what love and partnership entailed. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned to relationships. It was a topic Felina approached cautiously, but Nate broached it with an openness that surprised her. I hope you don't mind me asking, he said, his tone gentle, "but I noticed how strongly you reacted when I mentioned your scar the other day. I feel like there's a story there." Felina set her fork down, her eyes meeting his. She decided to be honest, though she chose her words carefully. "There is," she admitted. "Let's just say I've learned the hard way that love isn't always what it seems. I was with someone who valued the wrong things, who valued me for the wrong things. It took a lot to walk away from that." Nate listened intently, his expression serious but kind. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said. "No one deserves to feel less than whole because of someone else's narrow view." Felina nodded, feeling a small measure of relief at his understanding. "That's why I'm careful now," she added. "I won't fall into blind love again. If I ever let someone into my life, it'll be because they see me for who I am, scars and all." Nate leaned back, his gaze steady. "That's exactly how it should be," he said. "Love shouldn't be about perfection. It should be about connection, respect, and seeing the beauty in someone's whole story, not just the parts that look good on the surface." Felina studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But his words felt genuine, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. As the evening wound down, Nate walked her to her car. The night air was cool, and the city lights cast a soft glow over the streets. "I meant what I said earlier," Nate said as they reached her car. "You're an incredible woman, Felina. I'd like to get to know you better, but only if you're comfortable with that. No pressure." Felina looked up at him, her heart beating steadily. She was cautious, but she couldn't deny the attraction she felt. The quiet pull toward a man who seemed so different from anyone she'd known before. "I'll think about it," she said, her tone calm but with a hint of warmth. Nate smiled. "Fair enough. Take all the time you need." As she drove home, Felina replayed the evening in her mind. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility of opening her heart again. But only if Nate proved himself worthy. She had learned her lesson well, and this time, she promised herself, she would choose wisely. No more blind love, she thought as she parked her car and stepped into her home. If this is going to happen, it'll be on my terms. The morning began like any other at the hospital. Felina walked briskly to the operating room, her clipboard in hand and her mind focused on the task ahead. She had been informed the previous evening that she would be assisting in a surgery, but what she didn't know was that she would be working alongside Dr. Nathaniel Coker, the American surgeon whose presence had recently stirred something unexpected in her heart. When she entered the sterile confines of the operating theater, she found Nate already scrubbing in, his demeanor calm and focused. He glanced up as she walked in, his eyes lighting up briefly before returning to his meticulous preparation. "Good morning, Dr. Felina," he said warmly, his voice carrying through the room. "Good morning, Dr. Coker," she replied, her tone steady though her pulse quickened. The patient, a young boy with a severe cleft palate, had been prepped and was already under anesthesia. Felina studied the boy's chart, her heart aching for the child who had endured so much. "Today's procedure is delicate," Nate said, pulling on his gloves. "But with precision and patience, we'll give him a new chance at life." Felina nodded, taking her position beside him as the operation began. As Nate worked, Felina found herself utterly mesmerized. His hands moved with an artistry she had never seen before, each incision precise, each stitch perfect. He explained every step as he went along, his voice calm and instructive, as though he were conducting a masterclass. "Notice how the muscle layers are reconstructed," he said, glancing at Felina briefly before continuing. "This ensures both function and aesthetics are restored." Felina leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the intricate work he was performing. It was as if he were sculpting, reshaping the boy's palette with a blend of science and art. "Now this is where it gets tricky," Nate said, his tone unwavering. "You have to align the tissues perfectly, or the repair won't hold." Felina watched in awe as he executed the maneuver flawlessly. She felt as though she were witnessing a miracle, a boy's life being transformed right before her eyes. Throughout the surgery, Nate occasionally glanced at her, his eyes warm but never losing focus. Felina felt her heart skip a beat each time, though she quickly reminded herself to remain professional. But as the hours passed, she couldn't help but be drawn to his brilliance, his confidence, and his undeniable passion for his work. When the final stitch was in place and the surgery declared a success, the entire team let out a collective sigh of relief. Felina felt a surge of pride and emotion, overwhelmed by what she had just witnessed. As they began to clean up, she found herself unable to hold back her thoughts. Turning to Nate, she spoke without thinking, her voice filled with awe and something deeper. "Sir," she said, her words tumbling out unguardedly, "if I marry you, I would love for us to start a private clinic together and work under you for my entire lifetime. Doing this forever." The room fell silent. The other team members exchanged glances, but Nate remained composed, his lips curling into a small smile. He turned to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of warmth and professionalism. Slowly, he bent one knee in a playful gesture, extending his hand as though addressing royalty. "You are welcome, ma'am," he said, his tone light yet sincere. "It will be my absolute pleasure to have you by my side." The room erupted into quiet laughter, and Felina's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She quickly busied herself with cleaning the instruments, avoiding everyone's gaze. But as Nate rose and continued tidying up, he leaned in slightly and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "You're brilliant, Felina. I hope this is the first of many surgeries we'll do together." Felina smiled despite herself, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps her life's purpose and her heart's desires could converge in ways she had never imagined. The hospital buzzed with whispers the next day. Felina could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her as she walked through the corridors. Every step she took seemed to echo louder than usual, each glance her way carrying either admiration, mockery, or judgment. The rumor mill had spared no detail, twisting her unguarded words into fodder for gossip. Some spoke in hushed tones of her supposed bravery. "Imagine proposing to a man like Dr. Nate Coker," one nurse said. "She's bold, I'll give her that." Others, however, were less kind. "She crossed a line," a junior doctor muttered. "That's not how a professional woman behaves, no matter how handsome or talented the man is." The words stung, but Felina had steeled herself against public opinion. She reminded herself that people would always talk, especially when they envied what they couldn't understand. But it wasn't the whispers that broke her. It was the sly comment she overheard while passing a group of doctors during her rounds. "If I were Nate," one of them joked, his voice tinged with cruelty, "I'd only take her to the altar if she let me remove the mark of Cain on her cheek first." The words hit Felina like a physical blow. She froze mid-step, the clipboard in her hand trembling slightly. She wanted to turn around and confront him, to demand an explanation for such a heartless remark, but her voice seemed caught in her throat. Instead, she walked away quickly, heading straight to the hospital's restroom. Once inside, she locked the door, leaned against the wall, and let the tears fall. She had worked so hard to accept her scar, to see it as a symbol of her survival and strength rather than a flaw. But in moments like these, it was impossible not to feel the sting of shame and rejection. As she dried her tears and looked at herself in the mirror, Felina whispered to her reflection, "I am not defined by this scar. I am not defined by their words. I am more than this." She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and left the restroom. As she walked through the ward again, she heard another mocking comment, this time from a nurse who passed her with a sarcastic smile. "Welcome, ma'am, Dr. Mrs. Felina Coker, proprietress of Kofel Clinic International." Felina stopped, turned to face the nurse, and replied calmly, "Amen. So let it be." Her voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. She was determined not to let anyone see her pain, not to let anyone think they had the power to break her spirit. Later that evening, as Felina sat in her room reflecting on the day's events, she thought about Nate. Had he heard the gossip? What did he think? Did he see her differently now, after all the noise? But then she reminded herself that his opinion, while important, was not the foundation of her worth. She had learned the hard way that her value didn't depend on any man's approval. Not Synac's, not Nate's, and certainly not the hospital gossipers. If Nate truly saw her for who she was, he would come to her, scar and all. And if he didn't, she would move forward, head held high. She picked up her journal and wrote, "I am not ashamed of my feelings, nor of my dreams. I spoke my truth. Those who laugh today may one day envy the strength it took to speak." With that, Felina closed the book, her resolve renewed. Whatever the future held, she would face it on her terms, with her heart intact. The day had been heavy for Felina. The sting of cruel remarks and the whispers that followed her throughout the hospital had left her emotionally drained. She sat in the quiet of her office, gazing at the papers on her desk but unable to focus. Her mind was a storm of doubt and hurt when suddenly a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened slightly, and there he was, Dr. Nathaniel Coker, his presence lighting up the room like a ray of sunshine piercing through the clouds. He stepped in with a wide, confident smile, the kind that disarmed even the most guarded hearts. "Well, well," Nate began, his deep voice laced with warmth and humor, "if it isn't Dr. Mrs. Felina Coker of Kofel Hospital International." Felina blinked, startled by his words. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. He extended his hand toward her, and as she hesitated, his smile grew softer, more reassuring. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle now. "You can shake my hand. I promise it's not a contract yet." As she took his hand, she felt an unexpected warmth radiating from him. Not just physical warmth, but the kind that touched the heart and calmed the soul. "I've heard the rumors," Nate said, his tone serious now. "I know what's been said, Felina. And I also know it's been hurting you." Felina's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to appear weak. Nate continued, his gaze steady. "That scar on your face, it's not a mark of Cain. It's a mark of glory, Felina. It tells a story of resilience, survival, and strength. And I want you to know something." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I would never take you to the altar without that mark," he said firmly. "Do you know why?" Felina shook her head, her voice caught in her throat. "Because it was this mark that first drew me to you," Nate said, stepping closer. "It's like the burning bush in the wilderness that caught Moses' attention. It made me stop and look closer, and when I did, I saw something extraordinary. Beneath this scar is a beauty so profound that it took my breath away." Felina was stunned, her heart swelling with emotions she could barely process. Nate continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "As a surgeon, I've learned to see beyond the surface, to look past what others might dismiss. And that's what I saw in you, a hidden beauty locked behind the veil of what the world calls a flaw. When I called you a sleeping beauty, I wasn't being poetic. I meant every word. You are magnificent, Felina, just as you are." Felina's breath hitched, tears streaming freely now. Nate approached her cautiously, his hands raised slightly, as if seeking permission. She gave a small nod, and he reached out, his fingers tracing the scar on her cheek with the gentleness of a sculptor handling delicate clay. "This scar," he said softly, "is part of your story. It's part of who you are. And as a doctor, I can tell you that it would take me less than 5 minutes to remove it, to restore the angelic beauty you see in the mirror every day. But," he pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers, "that's only if you want it gone. No doctor has the right to impose treatment on a patient. The choice is entirely yours, Felina. I don't see this scar as something to be fixed. I see it as something to be cherished." Felina's hand instinctively rose to touch the scar, her fingers brushing against where his had been moments before. She was overwhelmed, not by his words alone, but by the sincerity and respect behind them. "Nate," she began, her voice trembling, "no one has ever said anything like that to me before. You don't know what this means to me." "I think I do," he said gently. "But I want you to know this. Whether you choose to keep this scar or let me remove it, my feelings for you won't change. My admiration for you won't waver. You're remarkable, Felina. And nothing, not a scar, not gossip, not the world's opinions, can ever diminish that." For the first time in a long while, Felina felt a profound sense of peace. She knew deep down that Nate wasn't just offering her words. He was offering her a future where she could be loved, respected, and valued for who she truly was. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "Thank you, Nate, for seeing me, for really seeing me." And in that moment, Felina knew she had found something far greater than healing. She had found a love that didn't need her to be perfect, only to be herself. The sun was dipping into the horizon, casting a golden hue over the city as Felina arrived at the recreational center. She stepped out of the car, her rare pink dress fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. It was a dress that perfectly hugged her figure, accentuating the natural grace and beauty that she carried effortlessly, even with the faint scar on her cheek. Felina took a deep breath and walked toward the open-air section of the center, where she spotted Nate sitting on a bench. Dressed in simple sportswear, his relaxed yet commanding presence was magnetic. His charm seemed to amplify with the simplicity of his attire, and when he saw her, his face broke into the familiar wide grin she had come to adore. Well, if it isn't my sleeping beauty," Nate teased as he rose to greet her. "What a vision you are tonight." Felina laughed softly, her cheeks warming as she closed the distance between them. "And here you are, my charming fairy prince," she replied, her voice playful but tinged with affection. "I've come to ask you to wake me up from my sleep." Nate raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her words, but before he could respond, Felina took a bold step forward. Her hands rested lightly on his shoulders, and she leaned in, her lips brushing his in a tender, unexpected kiss. As their lips parted, she whispered, "Don't you think I've slept long enough? You've awakened my heart, Nate. I'm ready for the operation. Please take away my shame and scar, and then take me to the altar as every wise one has suggested." But she paused, her voice softening as she gazed into his eyes. "Promise me you'll be gentle with me, as you were with that boy." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Nate stood frozen, his mind racing as he processed the intensity of her words and actions. His hands slowly rose to cup her face, his thumb gently grazing the scar she had just spoken of. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but his words were layered with emotion. "Felina," he began, his gaze unwavering, "you've just done something incredibly brave and beautiful. And yet, I cannot agree to your proposal." Felina's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and hurt flashing across her face. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate took a step back, though his hands remained on her shoulders, grounding her. "Because I love you," he said simply. "And I will not let you believe that you need to change yourself for me, for anyone else, or even for yourself if it's rooted in shame." She blinked, her tears threatening to fall. "But Nate," he gently silenced her with a finger to her lips. "Listen to me, Felina. This scar on your face, it's not shameful. It's not something that needs to be erased to make you whole. I love you as you are, not in spite of it, but because it's part of the incredible woman you've become. You've endured so much, and this mark is a testament to your strength and resilience." Nate took a deep breath before continuing. "I won't agree to remove your scar just because you think it's what I want or what society expects. I fell for the woman behind the scar, the woman with a heart so pure and a mind so brilliant. If we go to the altar, and I sincerely hope we do, I want to marry the real you, not some version of yourself you think I need." Felina's tears flowed freely now, but they were no longer tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of love so profound that it left her breathless. "Nate," she said after a long pause, her voice trembling, "no one has ever said anything like that to me before. I thought I needed to change to be worthy of love again." "You've always been worthy," Nate replied, his voice firm. "And if one day you decide to remove the scar, not for me, not for others, but because you want to, that's your choice. But I'll say this again, I love you just as you are. And I always will." Felina let out a shaky laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing as she felt the full weight of his words sink in. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I think," she said softly, "I've just fallen for you all over again." "And I think," Nate replied with a teasing grin, "you were never really asleep. You've been awake all along. You just needed someone to remind you how extraordinary you are." As the evening deepened around them, Felina and Nate sat together on the bench, the noise of the world fading away. In that moment, there were no scars, no rumors, no doubts. Only love, raw and real, just as it was meant to be. As the evening deepened and they began parting ways, Felina turned to Nate, her voice soft yet deliberate. "Nati," she said, playfully elongating the name, "I want to cook you a meal. Will you come to my place tomorrow evening?" Nate raised an eyebrow, both surprised and impressed by the new familiarity in her tone and her offer. He grinned, a teasing light dancing in his eyes. "Your Royal Highness," he said with an exaggerated bow, "I am at your bidding. I can't wait to come eat your meal. Just tell me there's no Haman waiting to be hanged." Felina laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Yes, Uncle Mordecai," she replied, leaning in conspiratorially. "Come along with your rope, because there are many Babylonians, and tomorrow evening is their judgment day." Nate shook his head, laughing at her wit. "You're something else, Felina. I'll be there." With that, they both headed to their cars. Felina, clearly in high spirits, started her engine and sped off with a mischievous wave, overtaking Nate's sports car with an unexpected burst of ferocity. Nate's heart skipped a beat as he watched her taillights disappear into the distance. "Felina," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. When Nate finally reached his house, he couldn't shake the image of her speeding off. Concern gnawed at him until he grabbed his phone and called her. Felina answered almost immediately, her voice light and cheerful. "Hello, Uncle Mordecai," she teased. "Felina," Nate said, his tone serious, "are you safe? That stunt you pulled back there could have gone very wrong. Please don't do that again." Felina chuckled softly, unbothered by his concern. "Don't worry, Doctor. My accident, my opportunity," she said cryptically. "What?" Nate asked, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean by that? But before he could get an answer, Felina ended the call with a playful, "Good night, Natty." Nate stared at his phone, her words echoing in his mind. My accident, my opportunity. He paced his living room, trying to decipher her meaning. Was she referring to her car accident? To the scar she bore? Or was there something deeper hidden in her words? As he finally lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Nate couldn't help but smile despite his confusion. Felina's playful yet enigmatic nature was drawing him in like a puzzle he was eager to solve. All right, Sleeping Beauty, he murmured to himself, closing his eyes. Tomorrow evening, I'll find out exactly what you mean. Sleep came eventually, though it was filled with dreams of pink dresses, scars, and the captivating woman who had turned his world upside down.